What if one of the most influential nations in world history was never supposed to exist? What if the land we now call England was not born from destiny or grand design, but from collapse, invasion, adaptation, and sheer determination to survive? Before there was a united crown, before there was a shared national identity, before the word English carried any meaning beyond scattered tribes, this land was divided, uncertain, and vulnerable. To understand how England was created, we must begin not with triumph, but with the quiet fading of an empire. For nearly 4 centuries, Roman rule shaped much of Britain. The Roman Empire brought roads, fortified towns, organized government, trade networks, and military protection. Roman legions guarded frontiers, maintained order, and connected Britain to a vast Mediterranean world. But empires do not last forever. By the early 5th century, Rome faced immense pressure closer to its heartlands. Resources were stretched thin. Distant territories became secondary priorities. Around the year 410 AD, Roman authority in Britain effectively ended. The legions were withdrawn. Administrators departed. The centralized system that had provided stability simply dissolved. What remained was not a nation, it was a power vacuum. Without Roman protection, the native Britons were exposed. Raids intensified from the north by groups later known as the Picts. From across the Irish Sea came the Scots. Coastal settlements were vulnerable to seaborne attackers. Local leaders attempted to fill the gap left by Rome, but unity was fragile, and regional authority often outweighed any sense of island-wide coordination. Faced with mounting threats, some Briton rulers made a decision that would permanently alter the island's future. They invited Germanic warriors from across the North Sea to serve as mercenaries and defenders. These newcomers were the Anglo-Saxons, groups of Angles, Saxons, and Jutes seeking opportunity as much as employment. Initially, their role was to defend territories against northern raiders. They were granted land in exchange for military service. At first, the arrangement seemed practical. The Anglo-Saxon warriors were effective fighters. They helped repel external threats. But as years passed, temporary settlements became permanent communities. Families joined the warriors. Cultural differences deepened. Gradually, the balance of power shifted. Instead of simply defending the Britons, the Anglo-Saxons began asserting their own authority. Conflicts emerged between the original inhabitants and the newcomers. Over generations, control of much of eastern and southern Britain passed into Anglo-Saxon hands. By the 6th and 7th centuries, new kingdoms had taken shape across the landscape. These were not yet united under one banner. They were independent realms with their own rulers, ambitions, and rivalries. Among these kingdoms were Kent, one of the earliest organized Anglo-Saxon realms, along with Essex and Sussex, whose names reflected the East Saxons and South Saxons. East Anglia became home to the Angles, while Mercia rose in the Midlands as a formidable regional power. Northumbria dominated large parts of the north, and Wessex emerged in the south as the kingdom of the West Saxons. Historians later referred to this collection of realms as the Heptarchy, suggesting 7 major kingdoms. But the political reality was far more fluid. Borders shifted frequently. Alliances formed and dissolved. Kings competed for dominance, sometimes through diplomacy and often through warfare. During this era, Christianity began spreading among the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, gradually reshaping their culture and political structures. Monasteries became centers of learning. Art and scholarship flourished in places like Northumbria. Yet, despite growing cultural sophistication, political unity remained elusive. There was no central authority binding these kingdoms together. No shared sense of a single English nation existed. Identity was local and regional, tied to individual rulers and territories. Power moved like a tide. At different times, Northumbria held influence. Then Mercia rose to prominence under strong leadership. Wessex steadily consolidated strength in the south. But even as these kingdoms competed among themselves, a new force was preparing to arrive, one that would challenge them all. In the year 793, a raid on the monastery at Lindisfarne sent shockwaves across the Anglo-Saxon world. Monasteries were not only religious institutions, they were cultural and intellectual centers. The attack was swift and devastating. Sea-born warriors descended unexpectedly, plundered valuables, and departed. These attackers came from Scandinavia. They were Vikings. At first, the raids were sporadic. Coastal communities were targeted for wealth and supplies. But over time, the scale and ambition of Viking expeditions increased. Raiding parties evolved into organized armies. By the mid-9th century, a large Viking force, often referred to as the Great Heathen Army, arrived with intentions that went beyond plunder. They sought land, control, and long-term settlement. One by one, Anglo-Saxon kingdoms fell under Viking pressure. Northumbria was conquered, East Anglia was subdued, Mercia weakened and partially divided. By the late 870s, only one major Anglo-Saxon kingdom remained fully independent: Wessex. The survival of Wessex would prove pivotal. In 871, Alfred became King of Wessex during one of the most precarious moments in its history. Viking forces had momentum. Anglo-Saxon morale was uncertain. Unity among the remaining territories was fragile at best. Alfred initially adopted a cautious approach, at times negotiating and paying tribute to buy valuable time. But he understood that survival required more than temporary arrangements. He reorganized defenses, studied his opponents, and prepared for decisive action. In 878, after enduring significant pressure and even temporary displacement, Alfred regrouped his forces. At the Battle of Edington, he confronted the Viking army and achieved a crucial victory. The outcome did not eliminate Viking presence in Britain, but it halted their advance into Wessex and preserved the kingdom's independence. This moment marked a turning point. Wessex survived when others had fallen. Alfred's legacy extended beyond the battlefield. He initiated defensive reforms, establishing fortified towns known as burhs that provided protection and rapid response capabilities. He reorganized military obligations so that defense was more sustainable. He promoted education and encouraged the translation of important works into the Old English language, strengthening cultural cohesion. His leadership began shaping something larger than Wessex alone. While much of northern and eastern England remained under Viking control in a region later known as the Danelaw, the groundwork for broader unity had been laid. Alfred's reign planted the idea that the Anglo-Saxon peoples could stand together against external threats. Though no unified England yet existed, the concept of shared destiny was beginning to form. When Alfred died in 899, the struggle was far from over. Viking settlements remained entrenched, political consolidation was incomplete, but Wessex had endured, and endurance would create opportunity. The next generation of rulers would build upon Alfred's foundation. They would push back against Viking control, expand their influence, and move closer to something unprecedented, a single kingdom that encompassed the Anglo-Saxon realms. The creation of England would not happen in a single moment. It would emerge through calculated expansion, strategic alliances, and continued resistance. Survival had been achieved. Now the question remained: could survival transform into unity? In Part 2, the reconquest begins, and the path toward one crown and one kingdom truly takes shape. What does it take to turn survival into supremacy? When a kingdom has barely escaped destruction, how does it transform from a last refuge into the foundation of a nation? At the end of the 9th century, Wessex stood alone as the final stronghold of Anglo-Saxon independence. Much of eastern and northern England remained under Viking control in the region known as the Danelaw. Yet within a single generation, that fragile kingdom would expand, reclaim lost lands, and give birth to something entirely new, the Kingdom of England. When Alfred the Great died in 899, he left behind more than territory. He left behind a system. Fortified towns protected key routes. Military service had been reorganized. Administration was more structured than ever before. Most importantly, Alfred had instilled confidence. Wessex was no longer merely reacting to Viking invasions, it was preparing for long-term strength. His son, Edward the Elder, inherited both the crown and the mission. But Edward did not stand alone in this effort. In neighboring Mercia, leadership had taken a remarkable turn. Alfred's daughter, Æthelflaed, became a central figure in governing Mercia after her husband's death. Known as the Lady of the Mercians, she proved to be a capable and determined leader. Together, Edward and Æthelflaed formed a powerful alliance that would reshape the political landscape. At the time, Mercia was divided. Parts of it were under Viking authority, while western regions remained aligned with Anglo-Saxon rule. Rather than rushing into reckless conflict, Edward and Æthelflaed expanded methodically. They strengthened defensive burhs along contested borders, securing territory step by step. These fortified settlements were not merely military outposts. They were administrative hubs, economic centers, and symbols of authority. Throughout the early 10th century, coordinated campaigns gradually weakened Viking control. Town by town, region by region, the Anglo-Saxon rulers pressed forward. In 917, several fortified Viking strongholds fell. East Anglia, once fully under Danish rule, was absorbed into Edward's expanding authority. Æthelflaed pushed northward, gaining influence across Mercia and even toward York. Her leadership inspired loyalty not through spectacle, but through consistent governance and strategic expansion. By 918, the balance of power had shifted dramatically. Many Viking leaders either submitted or withdrew. When Æthelflaed died that same year, Mercia faced a moment of uncertainty. Her daughter, Ælfwine, briefly attempted to succeed her, but Mercian nobles soon removed her from power. This political opening allowed Edward to assume direct control over Mercia, uniting it with Wessex under his rule. For the first time, most of the Anglo-Saxon territories south of Northumbria were governed by a single ruler. When Edward died in 924, his accomplishments were substantial, yet the work of unification was not complete. Northumbria, particularly the city of York, remained under Viking influence. The final step toward true unity would fall to Edward's son, Æthelstan. Æthelstan inherited a kingdom already stronger than any previous Anglo-Saxon realm, but he aimed higher than simple consolidation. In 927, he marched north and brought York under his control after the death of its Viking ruler. With Northumbria incorporated, Æthelstan became the first ruler to govern all of what we now recognize as England. Many historians mark this moment as the birth of the Kingdom of England. Yet recognition did not come without resistance. Neighboring rulers were wary of Æthelstan's growing power. To the north lay the Kingdom of Alba, the early medieval realm that would later evolve into Scotland. To the west stood Strathclyde. Across the Irish Sea, Norse rulers in Dublin watched closely. An expanding English kingdom disrupted the balance of power throughout the British Isles. In 937, this tension culminated in one of the most decisive battles of early medieval Britain, the Battle of Brunanburh. An alliance formed against Æthelstan, including Constantine II of Alba, Olaf Guthfrithson of Dublin, and Owain of Strathclyde. Their goal was clear: to halt the rise of English dominance before it became irreversible. The exact location of Brunanburh remains debated among historians, but its impact is undisputed. The clash was immense by the standards of the time. Armies converged in a struggle that would determine the political future of the island. When the fighting ended, Æthelstan emerged victorious. The alliance collapsed. English authority remained intact. Brunanburh did more than secure territory. It solidified identity. Contemporary poetry celebrated the victory as a defining moment, emphasizing unity among the English peoples. For the first time, the idea of a collective English nation, rather than separate Saxon or Mercian loyalties, took deeper root. Yet unity was not permanent simply because it had been declared. After Æthelstan's death in 939, challenges resurfaced. Olaf of Dublin seized the opportunity to reclaim York and parts of Northumbria. The kingdom that had seemed firmly united once again faced fragmentation. Æthelstan's half-brother Edmund ascended the throne during this instability. Rather than accept the loss, Edmund responded strategically. Over the next few years, he regained control of the contested territories. By 944, Viking authority in Northumbria had been expelled once again. England was reunited under a single ruler. But the pattern of the era was clear. Conquest, resistance, reconquest. Stability required constant vigilance. Edmund's reign was cut short by his unexpected death in 946. His brother Edred succeeded him and soon confronted another Norse challenge. Eric Bloodaxe, a Norwegian ruler, briefly seized Northumbria, reigniting conflict. For nearly a decade, control of Northumbria shifted between competing leaders, yet ultimately Edred secured the region permanently for the English crown. By the mid-10th century, Viking political power within England had effectively ended. Scandinavian influence remained culturally significant, particularly in former Danelaw regions, but the authority of the English king was now undisputed. This period of reconquest and consolidation transformed what had once been a patchwork of rival kingdoms into a coherent realm. However, military victory alone could not sustain unity. Administration, law, and diplomacy would prove equally important. As the throne passed briefly to Edwig and then to his brother Edgar, a new phase began. The foundation had been laid through conflict and expansion. Now the kingdom required stability. The transformation from a defensive alliance into a true nation was nearly complete. The territories were largely unified. External threats had been contained. What remained was the task of strengthening governance, reconciling diverse populations, including those of Danish heritage, and establishing durable systems that could outlast individual rulers. The Kingdom of England had emerged, but it was still young. Its borders required safeguarding, its institutions needed refinement, its identity demanded reinforcement. In Part 3, we will explore how this fragile yet powerful kingdom moved from conquest to consolidation under a ruler whose reign would bring order, reform, and the first sustained period of peace in a united England. What happens after the fighting stops? After decades of invasion, reconquest, shifting borders, and contested crowns, England had finally emerged as a single political entity. But unity forged in war is fragile. Victory on the battlefield does not automatically create stability in daily life. Laws must be agreed upon, loyalties must be secured, rivals must be managed, and perhaps most importantly, former enemies must learn how to live under one authority. By the mid-10th century, the Kingdom of England existed in name and territory, yet whether it would endure remained uncertain. After the death of King Eadred, the throne briefly passed to his nephew Edwig. His reign, however, was marked by internal tension among nobles and church leaders. Disagreements within the ruling elite revealed something important. External threats had once forced unity, but without them, internal divisions could resurface. When Edwig died in 959, his younger brother ascended the throne. His name was Edgar. History would remember him as Edgar the Peaceful. But peace does not mean weakness. In fact, Edgar's reign would demonstrate that sometimes the greatest strength of a kingdom lies not in conquest, but in control. Edgar inherited a realm that had been hard-won by his predecessors. Northumbria was secure. The Danelaw regions were under royal authority, Mercia and Wessex were firmly united. For the first time in generations, there was no immediate external invasion threatening to tear the kingdom apart. Instead of expanding through warfare, Edgar focused inward. One of his greatest achievements was reinforcing royal authority across all regions. England was not culturally uniform. Large areas of the north and east had deep Scandinavian roots due to earlier Viking settlement. Local customs, legal traditions, and land-holding patterns varied significantly. Attempting to erase those differences could have sparked resentment. Instead, Edgar chose balance. Rather than abolish the legal systems that had developed in the former Danelaw, he allowed many of them to continue under royal oversight. This decision reduced tension and fostered cooperation. It sent a clear message. Unity did not require uniformity. Loyalty to the crown mattered more than cultural background. This was a crucial step in transforming England from a conquered territory into a functioning kingdom. Edgar also strengthened the administrative framework begun by Alfred and expanded by Edward and Æthelstan. The boer system remained central to defense and governance. Shires were organized more clearly. Local officials known as reeves ensured royal commands were carried out. Law codes were refined to promote order and fairness. Royal assemblies became more structured, bringing together nobles, church leaders, and regional authorities. These gatherings were not merely ceremonial. They reinforced the idea that England was governed as a single realm under one king. Religion also played a stabilizing role. The 10th century saw a monastic reform movement within England. Influential church leaders worked to standardize religious practice and strengthen discipline among monasteries. Edgar supported these reforms, recognizing that religious unity could reinforce political unity. A kingdom that worshipped together could be governed more cohesively. One symbolic moment captured the height of Edgar's authority. In 973, he was ceremonially crowned in Bath in a grand coronation that emphasized his legitimacy as ruler of all England. Shortly afterward, several regional rulers from neighboring territories reportedly acknowledged his overlordship. Whether purely symbolic or politically strategic, the message was unmistakable. England was now a recognized power within the British Isles. For nearly 2 decades, Edgar's reign brought relative peace. Trade expanded, agricultural productivity stabilized, towns grew. Law and order were more predictable than in the turbulent decades before. This period of calm allowed something subtle but powerful to develop: identity. Earlier generations had identified primarily as West Saxons, Mercians, or Northumbrians, but under consistent centralized rule, a broader identity took shape. The concept of being English gradually replaced narrower regional loyalties. Shared law codes, common coinage, unified leadership, and coordinated administration reinforced this transformation. England was no longer just territory under one ruler, it was becoming a nation. Yet history rarely moves in straight lines. When Edgar died in 975, the stability he had cultivated faced immediate strain. Questions of succession re-emerged. His son Edward inherited the throne, but factional rivalry soon destabilized the court. After only a few years, Edward died under mysterious circumstances. The crown then passed to his half-brother Æthelred. The challenges facing the young king were different from those faced by Alfred or Æthelstan. Instead of fragmented Anglo-Saxon kingdoms or isolated Viking settlements, England was now wealthy, centralized, and visible on the wider European stage. And wealth attracts attention. By the late 10th century, Scandinavian interest in England had renewed. Raids began again, at first sporadic, then increasingly organized. But unlike the invasions of the 9th century, these new incursions targeted a fully formed kingdom. The difference mattered. England was no longer a collection of vulnerable states. It had administrative systems, fortified towns, standing leadership structures, and a shared sense of political unity. Even when external pressure returned, the framework of the kingdom remained intact. The foundations laid by Alfred had enabled survival. The expansions under Edward and Æthelstan had achieved unity. The reforms under Edgar had created stability. Together, these generations had accomplished something extraordinary. They transformed a post-Roman patchwork of competing tribes into a centralized medieval state. The creation of England was not a single event in 927. It was a gradual evolution. It was the result of adaptation after imperial collapse. It was shaped by migration, conflict, negotiation, and reform. It required leaders who could fight when necessary and govern wisely when possible. By the end of the 10th century, the Kingdom of England stood as one of the most organized and cohesive realms in Europe. Yet its story was far from over. Because unity, once achieved, must always be defended. In Part 4, we will witness how renewed Scandinavian ambition would test England's strength once more, how internal political decisions would shape the kingdom's future, and how the stage would eventually be set for one of the most famous turning points in English history. Can a nation that was forged through struggle survive prosperity? And when peace gives way to complacency, how prepared is a kingdom to face a storm it believes it has already endured? By the late 10th century, the Kingdom of England stood unified, organized and comparatively stable. The reforms of Edgar the Peaceful had strengthened administration, reinforced royal authority, and nurtured a growing sense of shared English identity. But unity did not mean invulnerability. Across the North Sea, Scandinavian ambition had not disappeared. It had only been waiting. When Edgar died, the smooth stability of his reign quickly faded. Political rivalries resurfaced at court. His son Edward briefly wore the crown, but his sudden death left the throne to his younger half-brother, Æthelred. He would later be remembered as Æthelred the Unready, though the nickname is somewhat misleading. It did not originally mean unprepared in the modern sense. Rather, it suggested poor counsel or ill-advised decisions. Still, the challenges of his reign would test England's resilience in ways few had anticipated. By the 980s and 990s, Viking raids resumed along England's coasts. At first, they resembled earlier incursions, swift attacks seeking wealth and supplies. But England was no longer a fractured territory. It was a centralized kingdom, prosperous and well-organized. That prosperity made it an attractive target. The raids gradually increased in scale. Scandinavian leaders recognized that England's wealth, its towns, monasteries, trade networks, and agricultural productivity offered enormous reward. Facing renewed attacks, Æthelred and his advisors chose a strategy that had precedent but carried risk: payment. Large sums of silver were paid to Viking leaders in exchange for temporary peace. This tribute became known as Danegeld. While it sometimes secured short-term relief, it also signaled that England possessed both wealth and willingness to negotiate under pressure. Word spread. More fleets arrived. This cycle of raid and payment strained the kingdom's finances and morale. Yet even during these pressures, the administrative systems built over the previous century functioned. Taxes were collected efficiently. Coinage was standardized. Fortified towns remained active centers of defense and commerce. England's ability to raise large payments reflected not weakness alone, but the strength of its centralized structure. Still, payment could not solve everything. By the early 11th century, Viking ambitions shifted from raiding to conquest. Among the most formidable of these leaders was Svein Forkbeard, a powerful ruler from Denmark. His campaigns targeted not just coastal settlements, but the heart of English authority. In 1013, Svein launched a major invasion. Region after region submitted. Facing overwhelming pressure, Æthelred fled across the Channel. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the kingdom painstakingly constructed over generations might collapse entirely. Yet something remarkable happened. Sweyn's sudden death in early 1014 created another power vacuum. English leaders invited Æthelred to return, on the condition that he rule more justly. This negotiation reflected how much the political landscape had changed since the days of fragmented Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Even amid invasion, the English elite expected structured governance and consultation. Kingship was no longer merely personal authority, it was institutional. Conflict resumed, however, when Sweyn's son, Canute, sought to reclaim his father's claim. Over the next few years, intense struggle determined the fate of the kingdom. After Æthelred's death in 1016, his son Edmund Ironside briefly resisted Canute's forces. Edmund fought fiercely, earning his nickname through determination in battle, but repeated clashes weakened his position. Eventually, England was divided between Edmund and Canute, only for Edmund's death later that same year to leave Canute as sole ruler. The crown of England now rested on the head of a Scandinavian king. Yet this was not the destruction of England. Instead, it marked an evolution. Canute, often remembered as Canute the Great, did not dismantle the English administrative system. On the contrary, he adopted and strengthened it. He ruled not only England, but also Denmark and Norway, forming a North Sea empire. However, within England, he relied heavily on existing structures: shires, law codes, taxation systems, and royal assemblies. He appointed powerful earls to govern key regions, blending Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon leadership. English law continued. The church maintained influence. Coinage remained standardized. The machinery of the kingdom endured. This continuity revealed something profound. England had matured beyond dependence on a single ethnic ruling group. Whether the king was Anglo-Saxon or Danish, the kingdom itself functioned as a political entity with established institutions. The creation of England had reached a new stage. What began as separate Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had survived Viking conquest and internal instability. It had endured foreign rule without disintegration. Its identity was no longer defined solely by who wore the crown, but by the structures that supported the crown. Under Cnute's rule, England experienced a period of relative order. Trade expanded across the North Sea. Diplomatic connections strengthened. The kingdom remained wealthy and administratively coherent. Yet, as always, succession would determine the next chapter. After Canute's death in 1035, his empire fragmented. Rival claims and competing heirs destabilized authority. Eventually, the English throne returned to the House of Wessex under Edward, later known as Edward the Confessor. By this point, England was firmly established as a unified realm. Its borders were largely defined, its institutions were entrenched. Its concept of kingship had evolved into something complex and deeply rooted. But another transformation loomed on the horizon, one that would once again reshape the kingdom in dramatic fashion. The events of 1066 were approaching. The foundations laid by Alfred, Æthelstan, Edgar, and even Canute had created a powerful and centralized kingdom. But that strength would soon attract the ambitions of another ambitious ruler from across the sea. In Part 5, we will witness how the struggle for succession after Edward the Confessor's death led to one of the most famous years in English history, and how the outcome would redefine England's future forever. What if everything built over centuries could be transformed in a single year? What if the kingdom forged by Alfred's resistance, Æthelstan's ambition, Edgar's reforms, and even Canute's rule was about to face its greatest test? Not from slow invasion, but from a sudden and decisive clash. By the middle of the 11th century, the Kingdom of England was no longer fragile. It had endured Viking conquest, internal rivalries, and foreign kings. It had developed one of the most organized administrative systems in medieval Europe. Royal authority reached across shires. Taxes were efficiently collected. Law codes were established. England was wealthy, centralized, and politically significant. But strength invites competition. When Edward the Confessor died in January 1066, he left no direct heir. The absence of a clear successor created immediate tension. Several powerful figures believed they had legitimate claims to the English throne. Among them was Harold Godwinson, the most influential nobleman in England. He was quickly chosen and crowned king by leading English nobles. Yet across the Channel, another ruler believed the crown had been promised to him. William, Duke of Normandy, claimed that Edward had once assured him of succession. William was not merely a regional lord. He was ambitious, disciplined, and prepared. To the north, a third contender emerged. Harald Hardrada of Norway, a seasoned warrior king with his own claim rooted in earlier Scandinavian agreements, prepared to assert his right by force. In 1066, England would face not one invasion, but two. The first blow came from the north. Harald Hardrada, allied with Harold Godwinson's estranged brother Tostig, invaded northern England. In September 1066, the Norwegian forces achieved an early victory near York. But Harold Godwinson responded with remarkable speed. Marching his army north, he confronted Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. The result was decisive. Hardrada was defeated and killed. The Norwegian threat collapsed. It appeared that England had once again defended itself successfully against Scandinavian invasion, echoing the struggles of previous centuries. But even as Harold celebrated victory, news arrived that William of Normandy had landed in the south. Harold's army, exhausted from its rapid northern campaign, had to march again, this time back down the length of England. Time was not on his side. William had chosen his moment carefully, waiting for favorable winds and political opportunity. On October 14th, 1066, the two forces met at the Battle of Hastings. The confrontation was intense and decisive. Harold's forces, largely composed of infantry and shield wall formations, faced Norman cavalry and archers in coordinated assault. For hours, the outcome hung in the balance. But eventually, Norman tactics prevailed. Harold was killed during the battle and his army collapsed. With Harold's death, organized resistance fractured. William advanced methodically. Some regions submitted quickly, others resisted and faced harsh consequences. By Christmas Day 1066, William was crowned King of England in London. The Norman Conquest had begun. Yet it is important to understand what changed and what did not. The conquest brought a new ruling elite from Normandy. The language of the court shifted toward Norman French. Architecture changed dramatically, with the construction of stone castles symbolizing control. The aristocracy was reshaped as Anglo-Saxon nobles were replaced by Norman lords. But the kingdom itself did not dissolve. The administrative framework built over centuries remained intact. Shires, taxation systems, royal authority, and centralized governance continued. In fact, William relied heavily on the existing English structures to solidify his rule. One of his most remarkable projects, the Domesday Survey of 1086, catalogued land ownership and resources across the kingdom with extraordinary detail. This was not the act of a conqueror dismantling a state. It was the act of a ruler seeking to control an already sophisticated one. The Norman Conquest did not erase England's identity. Instead, it layered new influences onto an established foundation. The English language itself would gradually absorb Norman French vocabulary. Legal systems would evolve further. Political structures would continue adapting. But the idea of England, united under one crown, defined by clear territory and centralized authority, remained unbroken. Looking back across these 5 sessions, the formation of England was not a single event in 927. It was not solely the victory at Brunanburh. It was not just Alfred's stand against the Vikings. It was a long transformation that began when Roman rule collapsed and local leaders struggled to survive. It passed through migration, conflict and consolidation among Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. It endured Viking conquest and reconquest. It adapted under Scandinavian rule. It stabilized under reforming kings, and finally it faced transformation under Norman leadership. England was not born in a moment of peace. It was forged in uncertainty. It was strengthened by adaptation. It survived because its institutions grew stronger than the individuals who ruled them. By 1066, the kingdom created over centuries proved resilient enough to withstand even conquest. That resilience would shape its future for generations to come. The story of England's creation is ultimately a story of endurance. From post-Roman collapse to Norman coronation, the land evolved from scattered tribes into a nation with identity, structure, and continuity. And perhaps that is the true lesson of its origin. Nations are not simply declared, they are built, defended, reformed, and rebuilt again. What began as survival became unity. What began as fragmented kingdoms became a state powerful enough to influence the course of world history. And it all started with a question of who would rule a land left behind by an empire. England's creation was never inevitable. It was earned. And that is how a land once abandoned by an empire rose through invasion, resilience, and transformation to become the Kingdom of England. If you've stayed with us through this entire journey, from the fall of Roman rule, through the rise of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, the Viking storms, the great battles, and finally the Norman Conquest, thank you. Your curiosity keeps history alive. History is not just about dates and crowns. It is about people. It is about decisions made in uncertain moments. It is about survival, identity, and the long road from chaos to nationhood. And when we look back at the making of England, we are reminded that no nation is built overnight. It is shaped by courage, leadership, mistakes, recovery, and the determination to endure. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the creation of England, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss the next journey into history. Leave a comment below and tell us, which moment do you think truly defined England? The stand of Alfred, the victory at Brunanburh, or the turning point of 1066? Share this video with someone who loves history as much as you do. Your support helps this channel continue exploring the stories that shaped our world. Until next time, may you continue to seek knowledge, question the past, and discover the powerful stories hidden within history. Thank you for watching.